The second lesson is taken from the 12th chapter of Paul's letter to his friends in Rome, the first 2 verses. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies, your very selves, as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you may discern what is the will of God for you, what is good and acceptable and perfect. To my eye, there seems a lot of emptiness out there around. A lot of activity as well, expenditure of energy, a lot of coming and going, but beneath it all, in many people's lives, a lot of emptiness, wondering what it's all about, whether it is worth it. Lack of direction and focus, going through the motions, the vacant stare, the distracted manner, the listless way. A woman writes to Ann Landers, I'm 44, husband same age, swell guy. We get along okay, no drinking, no gambling, no skirt chasing. He has a good job and our home is paid for. Our children are healthy and normal. They do well in school, and the 3 older ones, teenagers, have never caused us any trouble. So why am I writing? Because my life is blah. Something is missing. It's like stew without salt. I feel a certain emptiness. Well, there's a 45-year-old man on the staff of a weekly business publication. I suspect there are a good many persons like me who are irritated rather than soothed by the flow of life around them. I'm up against a blank wall some days, in a sense far more real than I care to admit. Something has been taken out of me. The great majority of my days are so filled with banality that all talk of purpose or meaning seems a strange sort of cant. Seems to me that the essential source of my trouble is a need for some unshakable conviction of the importance of living. Or as Ziggy puts it, sitting beneath a tree, staring at the moon, I've been here and I've been there and I've been up and I've been down and I've been in and I've been out and I've been around and I've been about, but not once, not even once have I ever been where it's at. If my picture is accurate at all, what is the problem with these people? What might there be about life in our time that breeds such emptiness, such lack of direction? It seems to me that the answer is almost implied in the question. I think for many people it's the loss of a sense of commitment to causes or purposes larger than the self. Human beings simply are in trouble when they try to reduce life down to living only for their own safety and survival and appetites and pleasures. J.B. Priestley describes the scene as he saw it. People like my parents lived in a real society, were members of a real community, whereas a great many of these young apartment people and suburban couples do not live in a society and are not members of a community. They are young people eating and sleeping and trying to enjoy themselves in a certain place with no interest in or feeling of loyalty or responsibility to that place. There's something thin and brittle about their lives. They lack richness, roots, sap, juice. It's simply a fact that high wages, shorter hours, more labor-saving devices, bigger houses, though excellent things in themselves, do not necessarily make for life. In any event, whether this is true of us or not, we do need to stay mindful and alert to the role of commitment in our lives, lest it begin to soften and fade. And we end up with some of the same apathy and boredom of my examples. We might begin by asking what commitment means. What are we talking about when we talk about commitment? Jim Kidd, friend of mine for many years at the Congregational Church in Wilmette, went to Connecticut from there, to Hartford specifically, and to the Asylum Congregational Church. And he said the first problem he had was the strangers who would come to church and say, why on earth would you ever name a congregation the Asylum Congregational Church? And he said he finally found his stopper. He said to them, we call our church the Asylum Congregational Church because all of our members are committed. Commitment implies a certain posture toward life. Commitment understands real life, life worth living, as the result of definite intention and decision. One thing that amazes me about the biblical faith from end to end is its emphasis upon individual choice. This faith is never coercive. After making the case, it invariably stops to say, well, what about it? Moses is pictured after 40 years of wandering in the wilderness with his people, standing before the Jordan River, and them, in the setting that Paul sang, the river in front of them, saying, choose this day, choose life that you and your descendants may live. And they could very well have responded, we thought we did that 40 years ago. We've been wandering around the wilderness with you for all these years, doing what you've told us to do for the most part, and now you tell us, decide? What's the point? Again and again, they are challenged about the intentionality of their lives, whether they are living decisive lives or beginning to drift. It's not a faith, you see, in a way that we can simply inherit. Sooner or later, one must embrace it willfully and decisively. You can go through life, you can get through the days, you can eat, sleep, labor, perhaps even love a bit without ever stopping to ask why, without ever making the decision, but it'll be life devoid of intensity and clarity and vitality and joy. Only as we decide. A great preacher in the last century, I can't imagine why, was asked, what must I do to go to hell? And the preacher responded, nothing. A man who had never belonged to any allegiance and was finding little purpose in life consulted his physician, who said, start somewhere and latch onto something bigger than you. Attach yourself to a major league ball team for openers and cheer it on. But clearly the commitment we're talking about when we talk about the Christian faith comes a bit higher and dearer than the Cubs of the White Sox. Paul, writing to his friends in Rome about the love of God, finally appeals to them to offer their lives, their whole beings, to the will of God. It's that commitment, he says, which above all else is your life. Then he does an interesting thing. If you ask people, or if you ask, as people do ask from time to time, how do I know the will of God for my life? That sounds pretty abstract. You get from Paul an interesting answer. He says, you figure it out. You discern yourself what the will of God is for you. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. So wholehearted commitment to the will of God may not mean doing anything different than you're now doing, day in, day out. But it may mean seeing what you already are doing in a totally different light. Not just as that which you do because it's there when you get up in the morning with the sun, but as that which God is calling you to do. Makes a lot of difference. Whether I write a sermon or run a business, it's something that just sort of fell in front of me and I got to do again another day, or whether I bring myself to see it as that which God wants me to do this day. Our problem on many days is not finding something more meaningful to do, it is to embrace with whole heart that which we have to do. Because with the embrace comes life. American philosopher Josiah Royce, 70 years ago, wrote that there's only one way to overcome what he calls one's natural idleness and apathy, and that is through aligning oneself with a consuming purpose or cause. He wrote, since no man can find a plan of life by merely looking within his own chaotic nature, he has to look without, to the worlds of deeds and causes. Only a cause, an absorbing and fascinating cause, which by his own will and consent comes to take possession of his life, only such a cause can stir him from his natural apathy. The cause, the will of God for you, can be any number of life's challenges. It can be raising a good family. It can be building a humane and successful business, sometimes hard to put together. It can be 101 other opportunities out there to serve, but they become life-saving as we identify them as that which God wants of me and embrace them in wholehearted surrender. Present yourself as living sacrifices. Throw yourselves into the fire of service. Keith Miller tells how it happened to him as a businessman. I used to walk down the streets and suddenly would break out in a cold sweat. I thought I might be losing my mind. One day it got so bad I got in the company car and took off, and as I was driving through the tall pinewood country of East Texas, I suddenly pulled off to the side of the road and stopped. And I remember sitting there in complete paralysis. Within me, conflicts raged that had been there for years. But I always had the feeling that there was one more bounce in the ball. After a couple of martinis and a good night's sleep, I could get going again. But I felt like a man on a gray treadmill. And I looked up toward the sky, and I said, God, if there's anything you want in me, take it. That was 10 years ago. But something came into my life that has never left. There wasn't a flashing light or a vision. There was a deep, intuitive realization of what it is that God really wants of a man. And the peace which came with this understanding was not an experience in itself, but rather a cessation of those old inner conflicts. I realized that God does not want a man's money or his time. He wants his will given to some purpose bigger than himself. And if you give it to him, he'll begin to show you life as you've never seen before. I knew to the core of my soul that I'd somehow made contact with the very meaning of life. I started the car and drove home. See, commitment to the will of God is an energizing move. And it's also a clarifying move. How so? Let me give you a description of a woman who is not doing the will of God. On Monday, she lunched with the housing committee with statistics and stew. She was filled. Then she dashed to a talk on crime in the city and dined with the Church Women's Guild. On Tuesday, she went to a Babies Week lunch and a tea on good citizenship. At dinner, she talked to the trade union bunch. There wasn't a date she dared skip. On Wednesday, she managed 2 annual dinners, one noon and the other at night. On Thursday, a luncheon for YW winners and a dinner on war, is it right? World Problems We Face was her Friday noon date, a luncheon address, as you guessed, and she wielded a fork while a man from New York spoke that evening on social unrest. On Saturday noon, she fell into a swoon, missed a talk on the youth of our land. Poor thing, she was through. She never came to. She died with a spoon in her hand. Now, not very good poetry, but you've been there, and so have I. And I said she's not doing the will of God for her life because the conviction that God has a will for our life includes the recognition that it is not more than you can do healthfully and happily. That is, if you're trying to do more than you can purposefully do with energy and enthusiasm, you're doing more than God intends you to do. Commitment to the will of God involves both a vigorous yes and some discerning no's. It energizes, but it also clarifies and simplifies. As this is Father's Day, I've got a couple of favorite stories of father, and one in particular speaks to this point. Georgia Harkness writes of her father, had the opportunities of today, or even a wider environment in his own time, been open to my father, he could have gone far. As it was, he went deep. As a young man, he made a considerable break from his local surroundings to attend Oswego Normal School, now State University College, and he hoped and longed to be a teacher. Just as he graduated, his father died, and as the only son, he felt that he had to stay at home to care for mother and the sisters. I have some of his diaries, and an entry when he was 22 years of age tells his life story in embryo. Quote, I'm sitting at the old table near the stove in the old room where I've sat so many times, and the old home seems dear to me tonight, though I often think that I would rather be away out in the world fighting great battles and winning great victories. But here I was born, here I've grown to be a man, and here 1 year ago today my father died, and here I should love to live and die if I thought I could be as useful to God, to the world, to my fellow men, as anywhere else. Georgia continues, and he did stay there for the rest of his life. Except when he was away at school, he taught a Sunday school class from when he was 16 years of age until he was 84 years of age. When he died at 88, they placed a plaque in the church he attended. It reads to this day, to the memory of J. Warren Harkness, historian and religious leader, 1848-1937. Incredibly simple life, but can anyone doubt a life also of great purpose and impact, and above all, contentment? So commitment to the will of God in and for your life energizes and clarifies. But I think most importantly, it stabilizes life, because commitment implies, does it not, long-term, implies continuity, implies faithfulness. And we do not grow and develop and become all that we can be without these, without time and place and continuous presence. In a recent article, Jean Blomquist tells of meeting Calvin and Mettie, elderly couple in the early 90s, and of her experience with them. And she concludes her story this way: a vow is always something you live into. If it's a worthy vow, it will beckon you in a fuller life and fuller humanity. And for over 66 years, Calvin and Mettie lived into the vows they made on their wedding day. And in their poorer times, they grew richer in love, cherishing the gift of each other. In sickness, they grew in health, that is, in the capacity to be present and nurturing and loving even in difficult circumstance. Calvin and Mettie's love continues to flourish even now in the lives of those most dear to them. It reaches out and embraces friends and even strangers like me, and their love and care give us the freedom to live and to commit our lives to one another. Yet we are constantly challenged in our efforts to live out and into our vows and commitments in this day. While condemning commitment as burdensome and restrictive, our culture spurns commitment as it rewards the outrageous, the foolish, the dazzling, the destructive with book contracts and movie options and endless media attention. But our culture lies, for true commitment frees instead of restricts. Wholesome commitment provides a safe environment in which to grow, to become, in our imperfections and ordinariness as well as in our exquisiteness, to become the people God calls us to be. True commitment may not make good copy, but it offers something far more precious, an abundant life where joy, peace, and love become real in the ordinary, everyday struggles and graces of our lives. Today is Father's Day, and my favorite tribute to Father was written by a little guy up in Milwaukee, my pop's tops, because he's not got a bad temper. He don't get mad easy, but when he does, he always has a good reason. Me. Because he lets me help him work in the garden even if I don't want to. He lets me take accordion lessons and practice outside. When I practice outside, he goes inside. He can tell better from a distance. He's never too tired to sit sprawled in his easy chair telling stories while we children wash up the dishes. Every child should love their father, because if it was not for their father, where would he be? Nowhere, that's where he'd be. If it wasn't for fathers, you wouldn't hardly see no children around Milwaukee. Today is Father's Day, and I'm inclined to add that Father, when he is at his best, is that kind of stability in one's life. Someone who is there, just there. One spring day, a tornado touched down in West Texas near little Paul's house. He was only 3 or 4 years old. At the first hint of trouble, his father hustled all the children inside, laid them and their mother on the floor together, and covered them with a mattress, which was the practice in that part of the world. Father explained they would be safe, but as they waited for the tornado, Paul realized that Father had not climbed under the mattress with them, but was standing at the window, watching the funnel cloud twist and turn across the prairie. And when Paul saw his father by the window, he knew where he wanted to be, and he struggled out of his mother's arms, crawled out from under the mattress, and ran and wrapped his arms around Dad's leg. And now, many, many years later, the Memory of that moment is vivid in his head, and he says, "Something told me that the safest place to stand in a storm was next to Dad." Stop and think about it, though. How many of the costly, intractable, major social problems of our day can be traced right back to fathers who are not there, physically or emotionally, in caring commitment? One can easily criticize an older style of masculinity that was not always so communicative or sensitive. But there's one thing to say for it. In far more instances than now, he was there. He was there. My favorite piece about that kind of father, which is the kind of father I had, is one Eric Sevareid wrote about at the beginning of his autobiography, Not So Wild a Dream. I share it with you. My mother always knew it was my father with whom I could not communicate because he could not communicate with his children. In my childhood, I thought he was God. In my early youth, I thought he was the Old Testament God, remote, stern, all-seeing, remorseless enforcer of commandments and laws and bylaws. It was in the process of this writing that I understood that he was the God of silent love. By then, I had experienced just enough physical hardship, weariness, disappointment, failure, just enough responsibility for the lives of others, so that my father's life suddenly became clear to me. The enormous stamina he devoted to his family's protection, the pleasures renounced for our sakes, the disappointments swallowed, the self-pity denied. It was then that there began for me a new appreciation of the strong, by which I do not mean the powerful or oppressive, a comprehension of how they make life possible for everybody else, a capacity to distinguish weakness from virtue and to understand with some clarity the weapons and tyrannies of the weak. As my father's greatness as a person revealed itself to me, my own paucities were simultaneously revealed, my blindness to him and no doubt to others behind the veil of self-absorption. I could hope desperately that there was something of the Father in the Son, and I sent him a letter saying, with restraint, but saying enough that I understood at long last, and asking his pardon for my tardiness. 8 years later, I sat by his deathbed, the only child present. My sister was away in North Africa with her soldier husband. My 2 brothers were away in the Korean War. It was as if I were commanded to see my father's life with total clarity. The lines in his face vanished. His eyes were powerfully blue and playful, and I saw the young athlete that my mother had fallen in love with many years ago. He spoke calmly, with restraint, even to the end. About the absence of the others, asked if I'd mind taking care of a few personal papers and make the arrangements for my mother. And at the very end, he patted the hand nearest to him and said, "It's all right, everything's all right." After the funeral, I looked through his effects, including his wallet, and in it, creased and yellowing, was the note I had written to him from New York. He had carried it on his person all down the years. The stability of long-time commitment, of faithfulness through time. How we need such fathers today. How we need to be such fathers. How we need to thank such fathers. Offer yourselves a living sacrifice that you may discern what is good and perfect for you.